There is a kind of man who has spent his whole life being looked through, and I want you to know, after 63 years of it, I have found it to be the single greatest advantage I have ever possessed. My name is Robert Caldwell. I am 63 years old. I drive a 1999 Ford F-150 that my daughter Claire has been quietly horrified by since approximately the second year of her marriage. It is dark green, or it was dark green once, before the sun and the Tennessee winters had their extended conversation about what color it actually wanted to be. Now it is something I would describe as an opinion about green rather than green itself. The passenger side mirror has a crack running diagonally across it that splits every reflection into two versions of whatever you're looking at. I have always found that philosophically appropriate for a man in my position. I live in the same house I bought 31 years ago on Crestwood Lane, a quiet street in Murfreesboro, where the neighbors still leave extra tomatoes on each other's porches in August, and the dogs know each other by name. My neighbor Hector, a retired plumber with a remarkable collection of wind chimes and opinions about college football, once told me over the back fence that I was the most regular-seeming irregular person he had ever met. I told him I did not know what that meant. He shrugged and offered me a beer. We watched his grandkids chase a sprinkler for 20 minutes and never returned to the subject. Here is what Hector does not know. What the men at my Sunday morning veterans breakfast do not know. What the young woman at the bank who once offered to help me open a basic savings account very gently, as though I might not be familiar with the concept, did not know when I smiled and said, "I appreciate that, sweetheart. I already have what I need." I founded Caldwell Capital Partners in 1991, after 20 years in the Army, 8 of them in special operations, the rest in strategic planning roles. I am still not fully at liberty to discuss in polite company. I built it from a single office above a barbecue restaurant in Nashville with 2 employees and a philosophy I had developed over 2 decades of watching men in high-pressure situations reveal exactly who they were when they believed. The outcome was already determined. The philosophy was simple. Move quietly, think 10 years ahead, and never let the room know what you know until the moment it matters most. Caldwell Capital Partners currently manages a little over $4.2 billion in assets across private equity, infrastructure, and defense sector holdings. My name appears in exactly the places I require it to appear and nowhere else. No profiles in financial magazines. No keynote speeches at conferences. No charity golf tournament with a banner that reads, "Presented by Robert Caldwell." I am, to most of the world, a retired Army officer in a faded green truck who grows decent tomatoes and has strong feelings about the designated hitter rule. I would not change a single detail of that arrangement. Now let me tell you about my daughter. Claire Caldwell Mercer is 36 years old, and she is, without any qualification or caveat, the finest human being I have ever had the privilege of knowing. She has her mother's eyes, and her mother's stubbornness, and a laugh that arrives late and then refuses to leave. The kind of laugh that makes a room feel like somewhere you want to stay. When she was 9 years old, she wrote a 3-page letter to the City Council of Murfreesboro about the need for better crosswalk lighting near her school. Included a hand-drawn diagram with measurements she had taken herself with a tape measure and delivered it in person. The crosswalk light was installed 4 months later. I kept a copy of that letter. I have kept every version of Claire I have ever witnessed. What I did not anticipate was Brandon. Brandon Mercer is 41 years old. He is 6'2", broad-shouldered, and handsome in the particular way of men who discovered early that being handsome would be sufficient and have never felt the need to develop much beneath it. He is a real estate developer. He will tell you he is a real estate developer within approximately 4 minutes of meeting you, and he will do it the way a man announces the score of a game he just won. He wears his success the way some men wear expensive cologne, applied heavily and in advance, so the room knows it before he arrives. Within the first 20 minutes of meeting me 4 years ago, Brandon had mentioned his firm's revenue projections, a resort development he was leading in Scottsdale, and the fact that he had recently been featured in a regional business magazine. He said regional business magazine without the slightest awareness that the qualifier was doing significant work in that sentence. I nodded. I said, "That's something, Brandon." He clapped me on the shoulder and told me Claire had told him I used to be in the Army. "Respect, sir," he said. "Truly." I have spent 30 years watching men perform respect. I know what it looks like when it's genuine and what it looks like when it is a social tool. I filed that observation away in the place I keep such things and said nothing else about it. What Brandon Mercer did not know, what he could not have known, because I had structured it deliberately so he could not, was that his firm, Mercer Development Group, had been operating for the last 6 years in significant part on capital sourced from a private infrastructure fund. A fund that was, through two holding layers and a Wyoming LLC with an unremarkable name, entirely owned by Caldwell Capital Partners. Brandon Mercer had been building his entire self-made story on a foundation that I poured. He had pitched himself as self-made to every room he had ever stood in, to every journalist who had profiled him, to Claire on their second date when he told her he had built everything from nothing with his own 2 hands and his own vision. He believed every word of it, because he had never looked carefully enough at the architecture underneath his own life to see whose name was on the original plans. I had watched this quietly for 6 years. I am a patient man. I learned patience in conditions where impatience killed people, and I brought that particular education home with me and applied it to civilian life. My father used to say that the man who waits with a purpose is not waiting at all. He is working. I had been working. The reason I need you to understand all of this is because of what happened on a Saturday morning in March, 4 months ago, which is where this story actually begins. Claire called me while I was in the garden, which is where I am most Saturday mornings, which she knows, which is why she calls me there when she wants to have a conversation she is not sure how to start. "Dad," she said, and I could hear it immediately, that particular tension in her voice that she has had since she was 12 and knew something was wrong but wasn't ready to say what. "Brandon's business partner, Derek Stahl, is in town. They want to have dinner. All of us. Derek's wife, Patricia, is coming. They've booked a private room at Harrington's. Harrington's is the kind of restaurant in Nashville where the menu does not list prices, which is either a statement about elegance or a statement about the belief that the people in the room do not need to concern themselves with such things. Either way, I find it mildly aggressive as a concept." "Of course," I said. "I'd love to see you, sweetheart." There was a pause. "Dad, please wear the blue blazer, the one Claire gave you for Christmas." "I'll think about it," I said. She said "Dad" in the tone that means she knows I will not think about it. She was right. On Saturday evening, I put on my cleanest khakis. A collared shirt in a shade that could be described as light gray or could be described as a shirt that has been washed many times and has arrived somewhere in the neighborhood of a color, and my everyday shoes, polished but not recently. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror. I looked like a man who used to be in the army and now grows tomatoes and has a complicated relationship with the designated hitter rule. I looked, in other words, exactly right. I drove to Harrington's in the F-150. The valet was a young man of approximately 22 who looked at the truck with the expression of a person encountering a dog at a formal dinner. Surprised, not sure of the protocol, trying to be professional about feelings he was clearly having. "Evening," I said, handing him the keys. "She drifts left at highway speeds. Don't let that concern you." He took the keys with both hands, which I found touching, and I walked inside. Brandon met me at the door to the private room with the energy of a man who had organized this evening with a specific agenda and was managing the logistics of it. He was in a charcoal suit. Derek Stahl was beside him, 52, compact, with the watchful eyes of a man who calculates things constantly and keeps the results to himself. Patricia Stahl was blonde, polished, wearing jewelry that was chosen to be noticed. "Robert," Brandon said, shaking my hand. "Glad you could make it. You remember Derek." "Of course," I said. "Good to see you, Derek." Derek's handshake lasted 1 second longer than socially necessary. I noticed Claire was already seated. She looked up at me when I came in, and her expression did something small and complicated that I recognized. Relief that I was there, mild concern about my outfit, and love underneath both. I sat beside her, and she squeezed my hand once under the table without looking at me. The dinner unfolded the way these things unfold when two sides of a table have very different understandings of what kind of evening it is. Brandon and Derek discussed deals, projections, a development in Phoenix that was apparently going to be transformational. Patricia talked about a recent trip to the Amalfi Coast. She said Amalfi the way certain people say place names, as punctuation in a sentence about what kind of person they are. I ate my steak. I asked questions. I complimented the wine, which was genuinely good. I said, "Is that right?" at appropriate intervals, and watched the room. What I was watching specifically was the way Derek Stahl looked at me. Not rudely, not obviously, but with the particular sideways attention of a man taking measurements. There was something being calculated there. I had seen that look across conference tables and in field briefings, and I knew what it preceded. Then Brandon set his fork down, which is the signal in these kinds of dinners that the social portion has concluded and the actual portion is beginning. "Robert," he said, and his voice shifted into the register that men use when they have rehearsed something. "We wanted you here tonight because, as Claire's father, your family. And this concerns family." Patricia folded her hands on the table. Derek sat back with the posture of a man who has already won. Brandon reached into the jacket beside his chair and produced a document in a cream-colored folder and placed it on the table between us. "Derek and I have an opportunity," he said. "A real one. A chance to take Mercer Development fully independent, self-funded, no outside capital. Build it into something generational. The kind of company that gets passed on." "That sounds like a real goal, son," I said. "The thing is," Derek said, leaning forward now, smooth, practiced, "the capital structure we're building requires personal guarantees at a certain level. We're looking for Claire to designate her future inheritance as collateral, just as a backstop. Fully legal, properly structured. It never gets touched unless something goes catastrophically wrong, which," he smiled, "it won't." He pushed the folder slightly toward me. "We just need your blessing, Robert, as her father." Patricia smiled the smile of a woman who has decided the outcome already and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. Claire's hand in her lap had gone still, but not relaxed. I know the difference. I looked at the folder. I looked at Derek. I looked at Brandon, who was looking at me with the confident, patient expression of a man who has decided that the retired army guy in the khakis across the table is the last obstacle between him and the next chapter of his life. And I thought, "You have no idea." "I appreciate you bringing this to me directly," I said warmly. "That means something. Let me take this home and read it properly. These things deserve careful attention." Brandon exhaled. Derek reached for his wine. Patricia's shoulders dropped a quarter inch. "Of course," Brandon said. "Take the time you need." "Last, thank you for dinner," I said. The steak was exceptional. I drove home through the Nashville night in the F-150 with the folder on the passenger seat and the cracked mirror catching the headlights of the highway behind me in two separate directions. I was calm. I am always calm. A former commander of mine once told me that the most frightening men he had ever served with were the ones who went quieter as things got more serious, not louder. I had taken that as a professional aspiration and a personal operating principle. I said nothing for 18 days. I tended my garden. I had breakfast with Hector on Wednesday morning. I went to the veterans' breakfast on Sunday and argued pleasantly about football. I read the folder twice on the first night and then put it in the drawer beside the others. On day 5, Brandon texted me, "Hey Robert, hope you had a chance to look things over. Exciting opportunity. Let me know if you have questions." He added a thumbs up emoji. I waited 4 hours. I replied, "Still reviewing. Appreciate your patience." Then I made a different phone call entirely, not to Brandon, not to Derek, but to my senior attorney, Margaret Chu, who has worked with Caldwell Capital for 22 years and who I have never had to explain context to twice. "I need you to pull the complete capital structure on Mercer Development Group," I said. "Every funding layer. Going back to the beginning." "I'll have it tomorrow," she said. She had it that evening. "Here is what I need you to understand, because this is the piece that changes everything." 6 years ago, when Brandon Mercer's first major project needed significant capital, he had accepted funding through a private infrastructure vehicle called Stonegate Capital Solutions. Stonegate was one of several fund structures that operated under Caldwell Capital Partners. Brandon's lawyers had negotiated the terms, had reviewed the documents, had done their due diligence on the fund's regulatory structure and the terms of the agreement. What they had not done What nobody had done, because nobody had thought it worth doing, was trace the full ownership chain of Stonegate Capital Solutions past the First Wyoming LLC. The fund agreements contained a clause, a standard fiduciary alignment clause that Margaret had drafted years before Brandon Mercer existed as a concept in anyone's life, that required any principal of a funded entity to disclose and obtain consent before using personal or spousal assets as collateral for a competing or derivative venture. A clause that was designed precisely for the situation in which a man decides that the capital that built him should be leveraged to build something designed to replace it. Brandon had been planning, with Derek Stahl, for approximately 10 months, to use Claire's inheritance as personal collateral for a new independent entity that would directly compete with Mercer Development Group's existing capital partner relationships. He had been doing this on company time, through shared resources, and in direct violation of the agreements that had made his career possible in the first place. He had been so focused on the self-made story that he had never asked a careful enough question about the architecture of his own foundation. I sat with the full report for 2 days. Not because I was uncertain. I am not, in general, an uncertain man. I sat with it because I have learned over 63 years that the decision made in the first hour of certainty is rarely as good as the decision made after the certainty has been given time to breathe and find its final shape. On a Thursday morning, I went to my closet and moved past the everyday section, past the khakis, past the chambray shirts, past the worn fleece I wear to the garden in November. At the back of the closet, behind everything, I have 4 suits, 2 navy, 1 charcoal gray, 1 dark green that I wore to Claire's college graduation. I took out the charcoal gray. I pressed it the night before. I polished my good shoes, not the everyday ones, the ones I wore when Caldwell Capital closed its largest acquisition in 2019, and I sat across the table from men who had flown in from 3 different countries to sign documents with my name at the bottom. I knotted my tie in the hallway mirror. I looked at myself for a long moment. Then I drove the F-150 to the offices of Mercer Development Group, which are on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Nashville, and I parked in a visitor's space, and I walked through the lobby with Margaret Chu beside me and 2 members of my legal team behind her. The receptionist looked up. She looked at me. She looked at the people with me. She performed the rapid calculation that receptionists in office buildings perform when a group of people arrive with documents and expressions. "Robert Caldwell," I said pleasantly. "I believe Mr. Mercer is expecting a routine check-in this morning. You can let him know I'm here instead." She picked up the phone. The conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the Cumberland River. It was, I will give Brandon credit, a beautiful office. He had good taste in views, if not in the finer details of contract compliance. Margaret and I sat at the head of the conference table. The 2 attorneys arranged the folders. The financial summary was on top, then the capital trace, then the fund agreements with the relevant clauses tabbed, then the 10 months of documented planning activity that Brandon and Derek had conducted on Mercer Development Resources and time. The door opened 6 minutes later. Brandon walked in the way he always walked into rooms, leading with the shoulders, easy, natural, the posture of a man who has been the most important person in most rooms he has entered for the last 15 years. He was in his charcoal suit, the good one, the one he wore to important meetings. He saw the attorneys first, then the documents. Then he saw me, sitting at the head of his conference table, in a suit he had never seen me wear, with the particular expression of a man who has been patient for a specific amount of time and has now arrived at the end of it. I watched it happen in real time, the way understanding moves across a person's face when it is moving through several floors of revision at once. The dinners, the khakis, the F-150, the folder at Harrington's, Derek's measured eyes across the table. Every single thing rearranging itself into a different configuration than the one it had occupied a moment before. The silence lasted 8 seconds. I let every one of them settle. Then I said, "Sit down, Brandon." He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I said, "and I want you to hear it clearly, not because I'm angry, because I am not angry. Anger belongs to men who didn't see the thing coming. I saw this coming. I want you to understand the shape of what you're looking at." I opened the first folder. Mercer Development Group has operated for 6 years on capital sourced substantially from Stonegate Capital Solutions. But Undersetting Gate is a fund structure owned entirely by Caldwell Capital Partners. Caldwell Capital Partners is my firm. Has been since 1991. The capital that financed your first project, your second, the Scottsdale development you've described in 2 magazine profiles as the achievement that defined your career, came from me. I did not tell you because it was not yet relevant. I moved to the second folder. Over the last 10 months, you and Derek Stahl have used Mercer Development resources, time, contacts, and infrastructure to plan a competing entity. The fund agreements you signed 6 years ago contain a fiduciary alignment clause that covers every element of what the documents in front of you describe. Margaret can walk you through the specific provisions if that would be helpful. Margaret did not move. She did not need to. I closed the second folder. Our legal team is prepared to pursue this to its full conclusion, which would be, I want to be direct with you, very public and very complete. Or we can handle this the other way. Brandon was looking at me with the expression of a man standing in a room he thought he knew that has turned out to have a completely different set of dimensions than advertised. The confidence he had carried in like a coat was on the floor. What was underneath it? What I saw in his eyes in that conference room with the Cumberland River in the window behind me was not defiance. It was not calculation. It was the specific shame of a man who has, for the first time, seen the complete picture of his own choices at once and recognized himself in it clearly. He did not look like the man from the magazine profile. He looked like a 41-year-old who had confused the foundation for the building and had been living in that confusion for 6 years. The other way, I said, is straightforward. Derek Stahl's involvement in Mercer Development ends today. The proposal from Harrington's, Claire's inheritance as collateral, is withdrawn permanently. You remain as principal of Mercer Development under a restructured agreement, which Margaret has prepared, that aligns your incentives correctly and rebuilds this relationship on terms that are transparent on both sides. From this point forward, no more architecture you don't fully understand. No more foundations you haven't read all the way down. I paused. And Brandon, you called Derek yourself. Today, before you leave this building. He looked at the documents. He looked at Margaret. He looked out at the river. He looked back at me. How long have you known? He said, quietly. About the Stonegate connection? Since Claire brought you home for Thanksgiving 4 years ago, I said. About the competing venture? 10 months and 2 weeks. He absorbed this. Why didn't you say anything? Because, I said, I needed to know who you were, not who you performed as. A man will tell you who he is, if you give him enough time, and enough quiet, and enough room to believe nobody important is watching. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I'll call Derek. Good, I said. I stood, buttoned my jacket, picked up my folder. One more thing, I said at the door. The inheritance conversation, the one at Harrington's, the one Derek, framed as a family discussion. I had Claire's trust restructured and transferred into her name directly, irrevocably, 3 days after Harrington's. Sole signature authority, no collateral capacity without an independent trustee review that takes 60 days minimum. The document from that dinner is a proposal about assets that have not been in a reachable position for 2.5 weeks. I picked up my hat from the chair. Tell Derek the river salmon at Harrington's was overcooked. The steak, though, was first rate. I drove home in the F-150. The engine did its morning ceremony. The cracked mirror caught the downtown skyline, splitting it neatly into 2 versions of the same buildings, and I found that, as I had always found it, approximately right. I pulled onto the highway heading south, the kind of calm that follows a decision that has been correctly made settling in around me the way quiet settles in after a long rain. I had told Claire I would call her when it was done. I called her from the driveway. She arrived 40 minutes later and found me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, black for me, 1 sugar for her, the way it has been since she was 16 and decided she was old enough for coffee, and I decided she was right. She sat across from me and looked at my face the way she has looked at my face her entire life, reading it with the fluency of someone who has studied it for 36 years and knows every room it contains. I was in the charcoal suit still. She had never seen me in it. Dad, she said, start from the beginning. So I did. from 1991, from the barbecue restaurant in Nashville and the two employees and the philosophy about watching men reveal themselves under pressure, from the Stonegate Fund and the capital that built Mercer Development from its first project forward, from the clause Margaret had drafted years before Brandon existed as a concept, from Harrington's and the 18 days of quiet and the restructuring of her trust in the conference room on the 14th floor that morning. All of it, laid out piece by piece on the kitchen table, the way you lay out a map when the journey is finally over and you want to understand the full distance of it. When I finished, Claire was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was doing what my kitchen does in the early afternoon, the oak tree outside the window moving slowly in whatever it is that passes for a breeze in March in Tennessee, the house settling in that way old houses settle, small creaks and adjustments like a person shifting weight. Then she looked up. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you ever tell me about any of it? The company, the capital, what you built. Why did I think you were just—" She stopped. "Why did I think you just had a pension and a garden?" I looked down at my coffee. I looked at the oak tree through the window. I looked at my daughter, at her mother's eyes in her face, at the 9-year-old who wrote a letter to a city council and measured the crosswalk herself with a tape measure and won. "Because," I said, "I needed you to choose your life, not have it chosen for you by what I own or what I've built or what my name can open. I needed you to be you before you ever had to figure out what it means to be mine. I wanted you to look at me and see your father, just your father. A man with a truck that needs a new mirror and strong feelings about baseball and tomatoes that come in better some years than others." She didn't say anything. "And," I said, "I needed to know the people in your life were there for you, not for what they might eventually find out I was worth. That required some time and some patience." She cried, not dramatically, not the way people cry in movies, the way real people cry when something they didn't know they had been carrying for a long time is finally set down somewhere safe. I reached across the table and held her hand and let her, and outside the oak tree kept doing what oak trees do, which is stand there and outlast most of what passes around them. After a while she said, quietly, "What happens to Brandon?" "He has work to do," I said. "Real work. The kind that doesn't have anybody else's foundation underneath it. That's either going to teach him something or it isn't. That part is up to him." She nodded slowly. "And Derek?" "Derek," I said, "is no longer relevant to your life, or mine." She was quiet for another moment. Then that laugh arrived, the one that starts quiet and takes over the room before she realizes it's happened. "You drove the truck," she said. "I drove the truck," I said. "To fire your son-in-law. To have a clarifying conversation with my son-in-law, yes. In the F-150. She runs fine," I said. "The drift is only at highway speeds." Claire shook her head. She was still smiling. She looked at me in the charcoal suit with the coffee cup between my hands, and she shook her head again, the way a person does when they have just been handed a piece of information that requires them to rebuild a room they thought they already knew the dimensions of. "Dad," she said finally, "you are the most unfancy, extraordinary person I have ever met in my life." I thought about Hector over the back fence, wind chimes and all. I thought about the most regular-seeming irregular person he had ever met. I thought about the young woman at the bank and her offer to help me open a savings account. "I'll take that," I said. We sat there in the afternoon light, 2 cups of coffee going slowly cold, the oak tree keeping its own counsel outside the window. And I thought about Brandon Mercer sitting in a restructured office in a glass building on the 14th floor, looking out at the Cumberland River, and understanding for the first time that the foundation underneath everything he had built had a name he had never thought to read. I thought about Derek Stahl and Patricia and the Amalfi Coast and the measured eyes across the table at Harrington's. I thought about all of it, and then I let it go, because the only thing in that kitchen that had ever mattered to me was sitting across a wooden table with her mother's eyes and a laugh that takes over rooms, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone a little cold, looking at her father the way she has always looked at her father, like a map she has known her whole life and is only now reading at its full scale. Some men spend their whole lives trying to look like what they are. I spent mine making sure nobody knew until the moment it mattered. The ones who look past you The ones who calculate your worth by your truck or your jacket or the way you hold a fork at a dinner they designed to make you feel the distance, they always find out eventually. They just never find out the way they expected. If this story meant something to you today, take a second and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it means more to us than you know. I'll see you in the next one.